Hello, I'll be taking you on a journey through the ancient Roman culture. First, we'll start with sculpture. The Romans wanted their sculptures to be more realistic, natural, and lifelike, unlike the Greeks. The Romans wanted their sculptures to remind them of specific individuals, which explains why they were so natural and lifelike. The Romans felt that a character of a person could best be shown through facial features and expressions, which is why they made a lot of busts, which is the head and shoulders of a person. The Romans also liked their sculptures to be free flowing, very characterful, and in narrative relief scenes. In our next stop, we'll be talking about the women's role. Women ran the household. Their job was to cook, clean, and teach their daughters. Most women worked in the house or the shop. Rich women could become priestess. The most important priestess were the Vestal Virgins. Few women ran their own businesses. There were professions such as midwives, hairdressers, and doctors for few women, but not everyone was allowed. The Romans also trained some women slaves as gladiators. Politics. Romans called their form of government Republica. Republica meant a matter for the people. Each year, two officials called councils were elected by the citizens. Citizens could only be men. Councils had as much power as the kings. The councils were in charge of the army. All decisions had to be unanimous between the two councils. Praetors were the chief judges. Censors kept the register of citizens who were entitled to vote. Quaestors looked after state finances, and aediles were in charge of all public work. The Senate was made up of ex-officials. They formed a parliament that discussed matters of state and advised officials. In ancient Rome, pottery was produced in large quantities. They were used for storage, and they came in the form of jars, dishes, and bowls. There were two types of potteries: fine ware and coarse ware. Fine ware was used for more formal events such as dinner, and coarse ware was used for everyday use, much for the storage of the different foods that they had. Next, we'll talk about food. In the countryside, farmers grew for people in the city. In ancient Rome, the part where today is Italy and North Africa is where olives and grapes were grown. In the now northern Europe, cabbages and carrots were grown. Also, cattle and sheep were kept there for meat. Most families ate simple meals, and their mother's job was not to waste any food. On a typical day, you might eat lentil and bean stew. You rarely ate meat because it was expensive. Fish sauce called garum is very popular. The rich eat very different food than the poor. They eat really one meal a day, and it is often a big feast and starts around 4 p.m. and can last for several hours. And what they do is you eat a lot, and then you throw it up, and you continue to eat until all the food is gone. When the rich ate, the slaves prepared several unusual courses. For example, songbird and asparagus sauce, rodent cooked in honey, and plenty of fresh fish and fruit like figs and grapes. Next, we'll go to paintings. Paintings were very popular. Their most prestigious form was the portraits. Portraits were painted on wood panels, and they vary in artistic quality, and they were very realistic. Also, Romans liked mural paintings. Because they did not like to hang things on the wall and other homes, they hired artists to paint murals. A mural is a large picture painted directly on the wall. There was almost a mural in every home. The painters that painted the murals tried to recreate the world around them as accurately as possible, and they painted landscapes and pictures of buildings that suggested a world that lay beyond the walls of the room. These scenes often create the impression that you are gazing out of a window. Next is fashion and jewelry. First, we'll start with hairstyles. Roman men and women took a lot of care over their hair and appearance. Until 2nd century CE, most men were clean shaven, but after that, beards became popular. Men's hair was usually combed forward. Women's hair was simple, but some had elaborate curls. Some women wore wigs or dyed their hair using plant extracts. Next is clothing. Many women used makeup for pale complexion because it was fashionable. They used that by using chalk or white or lead. And some women made lipstick out of red ochre, and they also used the red ochre for their cheeks. And some of the cosmetics used were poisonous, but they didn't know that because they didn't have the technology. For the clothing part, in some parts of the Roman Empire, men wore tight trousers, but in most places they wore a tunic. Roman citizens could wear the toga, a large semicircular piece of cloth wrapped loosely around the upper body. This was a symbol of manhood and citizenship. Women wore undertunics with a dress called a stola on top. For jewelry, both men and women wore jewelry. This included brooches, necklaces, and rings. Most jewelry was made of glass or cheap bronze. Many women had their ears pierced for earrings. Decorated brooches held clothing together. The Roman religion. Early Romans believed gods and goddesses and powerful spirits were everywhere, and that they controlled human actions. Romans adopted gods and goddesses from other people, especially the Etruscans and the Greeks. The king and queen of the Roman gods were Jupiter, the great god of the sky, and Juno, the patron gods were Jupiter, the great god of the sky, and Juno, the patron goddess of women. The Romans also liked gods and goddesses that were worshipped in other countries that they ruled, including the Egyptian Isis and the Persian Mithras. These gods were worshipped at altars and other places. They were also given sacrifices. After Constantine converted to Christianity in 313 CE, Christianity became the Roman Empire's official religion. Next is architecture. The Romans were excellent planners and builders. Many Roman architecture has survived. The Romans excelled at architecture. Roman architects built on a grand scale and used concrete. They adopted aspects from Greek architecture. They believed that public buildings should be made to impress as well as perform a public function. The dome permitted construction of vaulted ceilings and provided large covered space such as the public baths and basilicas. An example of the dome would be the Pantheon. Most Roman cities had at least one thermae, which were centers of public bathing and socialization. Columns were used for decoration instead of support. Lastly, burial practices. When a person died, they would be washed and dressed in their finest clothes. A coin would be placed in the mouth, under the tongue, or on the eye, so that the ferryman was paid to row it to the land of the dead. After being laid out for 8 days, it would be buried. Burials took place outside of the city to limit the disease spread. In ancient Rome, funerals were very expensive. Before burial was in place, most people were doing cremation, but then they shifted to actual burial. While using the cremation method, the ashes were placed in glass urns, which